Hey everyone, my name is chaosdrive and I'm making a game. It's a cyberpunk metroidvania with a focus on story. It's been a while since my last devlog. I worked on a lot of art and core game mechanics, as well as remaking some of the previous mechanics. This was all very time consuming, but very necessary. This devlog has significantly more content than the others, so I'm not going to spend as much time showing the time-lapse footage, and I'll spend more time explaining what I actually got done. Also, if you haven't seen my previous devlog videos, I recommend watching those first. But without further ado, let's get into it. So far, I had a theme planned for each of my devlogs that I would focus on for the entirety of it. The first one was player movement, and the second one was combat. I wanted for this third devlog to be about level design and environment creation. However, this isn't something you can do in one video. The video game environment evolves and changes over the game dev process, and it's hard to stay on topic when I'm coding, especially when there are always ideas and game mechanics popping up that need my attention. So moving forward, my devlogs won't follow a strict theme per video, but instead just mainly show my progress of what I got done since the last devlog. With that said, I'll start by talking about the first big thing that I wanted to add into the game: enemies. I thought I would start small by making a simple enemy for the player to encounter. This enemy I wanted to be somewhat predictable, but still difficult enough that you have to try in order to beat them. For the design of this enemy, I went with one of the most common enemies in video game history: a slime. Making the art was pretty easy. I've drawn a lot of slimes before, so this wasn't too difficult. The little spikes were just a stylistic choice that I thought would add to the environment. Usually in video games, slimes are pretty easy to kill, but I wanted to take a different approach. So my idea for the slime attack was for it to jump into the air and then do a really fast dash towards the player that requires dodging at the right moment. So I made two sprites, one for when the slime is on the ground and one for when it's in the air. After this, I jumped into Spine to make the animations. There was just a few easy animations that only required squishing and stretching the image. One for the idle, one for moving, and one for when the slime jumps. After the animations were done, I started the coding process. For a simple enemy like this, it didn't take very much work. I coded the slime to have 4 states: idle, wander, chase, and attack. The idling state is pretty self-explanatory. The slime just sits in place, but every game step it has a random chance to go into its wander state. In the wander state, the slime just moves in a random direction, very slowly. For this, I just decreased the image speed for its moving animation. This makes the enemy feel a little more alive and natural, rather than having it just sit still until the player interacts with it. If the player comes within a certain range of the slime, it goes into its chase state, where it moves faster towards the player. During the chase state, the slime has a set chance to attack every game step. This happens pretty often and might depend on a luck stat if I decide to add one later on. This is what the slime attack looks like. I added some slime particles as well, as a very subtle camera shake when the slime dashes to add some flair. After the slime attacks, it gets stunned for a little less than a second to give the player time before the slime attacks again. The player can't take damage at the moment, but that's definitely something I will get into in upcoming devlogs. I was pretty proud of how the slime turned out, and how it felt to try to dodge its attacks. This got me thinking about my combat system, and I realized that I didn't really like how the player attacks felt. Now, fortunately for me, I didn't redo the whole system, because the main problem was in how the attacks looked. The sword slash effects are what I hated the most. They just looked too amateur. So I ended up spending about 5 hours watching pixel art videos while animating an A-sprite with my drawing tablet. The problems with the combat animations were a big issue for me, and spending that time to redo the effects was definitely worth it. Here are the old slash effects compared to the new ones. A big improvement. I was excited, but before I added these new slashes into the game, there was one more effect I wanted to create for the combat. I wanted there to be an effect that played only when an enemy actually gets hit by the weapon slashes, to make hitting the enemies more satisfying than just swinging your sword at nothing. After a decent A-sprite session, I came up with this little animation. This would play on top of the enemy when it gets hit, and I would rotate the effect according to the angle that the player hits the enemy at. After I had all these new animations collected, I jumped into GameMaker Studio to implement them. This is what the new slash animations look like in-game. And this is what it looks like when you hit a slime. As you can see, I also added a frame when the enemy gets hit where the whole screen goes black except for the player, the enemy, and the effects. This was inspired by hit impact frames in anime, and it adds a lot to the overall feel of the attack. At this point, I was really excited about how the game was evolving into a game that is actually fun to play. There's one last thing that I wanted to cover in this devlog. My original idea for this devlog was level design, so of course I started on it, although I didn't get very far, but I'll explain what I did. I drew up a little map for the first location in the game. It's going to be a nuclear wasteland type environment. With this game being a metroidvania, I'm splitting each area into separate rooms of varying sizes for the player to explore. For me to make a separate game maker room for each of these rooms would be inefficient and resource heavy, because of how many areas and rooms I have in mind for the game. So I decided to make one giant game room for each of the whole locations in the game. So one room asset would hold the entirety of the wasteland area. This would be more efficient, but pose its own issues. One of these issues that I plan on solving in the near future has to do with each room having a different background. Another issue, which I solved pretty quick, was about the camera movement. I didn't want the player to be able to see into other rooms than the ones he's currently in. This is me recreating my drawing of the first game location in GameMaker Studio, or at least the bare bones of it. It's just the outline of each room. The green and yellow lines you see are objects I coded that act as borders for the rooms, and I made a separate object that basically just checks the nearest borders and detects which room the player is currently in. Using this information, I clamped the camera object to the room border so it's locked into the current room. That all took a bit of time to set up, but it will make it really easy for me to do room-specific actions in the future. I didn't get very far on level design, but I did make a bit of environment art. Now, I'm no professional pixel artist, but my experience comes solely from designing games, so naturally I watched a lot of YouTube tutorials before even attempting to make the Wasteland tile set. I also found a really cool color palette off the Low-Spec website that kind of captured the vibe I was going for. There was a lot of going back and forth and tweaking colors and shades during this process, and the tile set is still not done, but I made progress, and that's what these devlogs are about. After finishing a rough version of the tile set, I made the first background for the wasteland. This was really fun because I got to design what I wanted the parallax to look like and how each layer moves differently. I also got to start adding a bit of lore to my game by placing mysterious objects in the background. On top of the tile set and background, I also created 2 buildings, one of which I have uploaded a time-lapse of me making as a sort of devlog 2.5. I really wanted to see how these assets looked in-game, so I threw them into GameMaker and designed a little room for them. Before I show the result, I should also mention that I made a water object that goes in the foreground, and it basically just reflects whatever is above it and applies a distortion effect to it. So, without further ado, here's the first version of the Wasteland. It's looking really good. All the assets blend together nicely. And one of the things I was most excited for was this cellular tower. I created a ladder and also an animation for the player to climb up and down it. I was excited about the vertical parallax because I made a hidden city in the background that slowly gets revealed as you climb upward. Overall, I really like how it turned out, and I'm excited to create the rest of the Wasteland. As you can see, I've made a lot of progress since the last devlog, and the game is constantly improving. If you enjoyed this devlog, consider dropping a like and subscribing, and leave a comment if you have any feedback or recommendations for me or the game. Anyways, thanks to everybody who stuck out to the end, and I'll see you guys in devlog number 4.